Well, good morning, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers of this research day for inviting me to present the Kees de Lange Memorial Lecture. This is a huge honor for me. I have known Kees since he was a PhD student at the University of Alberta, and it was pretty clear from that time that he was very special and that he was going to make a great contribution to the field of swine nutrition. And so I want to say a few words before I get into the rest of my presentation to share with you some of the thoughts I have about Kees and indeed what some other people have said. For example, I contacted one individual who said Kees as a person radiated great integrity. He was a passionate professor and one of the very best scientists in his field in the world. And I think most people would totally agree with that statement. Another said he was never satisfied with how things were being done today. He preferred to focus on how it could be done better tomorrow. And anybody that knows Kees knows that he was constantly searching to do better. He was at the forefront of studying the fate of amino acids in pigs after intake. And another stated, Kees aimed to bring new knowledge in nutritional physiology of pigs into practice by incorporating this into a model. And certainly one of the areas that Kees excelled in was his advancement of growth simulation models in order to apply very diverse knowledge at great depth and apply that in a manner that could be used in practical day-to-day swine nutrition. When I looked at Kees's publications and the ones that were the most cited, one of the things that struck me was that his most cited publications were those that were associated with his PhD thesis. I think there's very, very few of us who could say that. But if we look at the three publications here that evolved from his thesis, one was cited 198 times, another 180 times, and another 154 times. That is a tremendous accomplishment for three publications from a PhD thesis, and therein lies, I think, the essence of who Kees was. He started out making a great contribution, especially as it related to endogenous secretions, and he used that as a stepping stone to move further and further into the field of swine nutrition with greater and greater understanding of amino acid nutrition, energy nutrition, and so on. And I think is another feature of Kees's career that we're going to miss hugely, and that was he was one of those rare individuals that could study in a number of different areas like an amino acid, like energy, like liquid feeding, and so on, and maintain great depth in his understanding and in the quality of his research. And very, very, very few people in the history of swine nutrition have been able to do that. I consider Kees to have been a thought leader in swine nutrition. I believe our discipline is going to miss him a great deal. And we've got lots of young people who are coming up in the field of swine nutrition who are going to make their own contributions. But Kees indeed was very, very special. And so I thank the University of Guelph for recognizing Kees in this manner with the Kees de Lange lectureship. Another feature of Kees was he was not satisfied with simply new knowledge. He wanted to develop new understanding. And a second thing that I feel was that Kees was not fully satisfied with new understanding. He wanted this new understanding to be applied and thus to improve pork production. So you can see the continuum there of Kees's role in science. There was new knowledge, moving to understanding, moving to application, moving to improving pork production. Okay, so now I'll move on to the second part of my presentation, which is really looking at the evolution of diet formulation and where things might be going with diet formulation in the future. So my take-home messages are going to be, I'll serve these up to you here right at the very beginning. Number one is there will be an enhancement in how energy is quantified. Energy is just too expensive part of the pig's diet and too large a proportion of pork production budget for us to be satisfied with where we are now. We have come a long way, but we have a ways to go yet in order to quantify energy more precisely, both in how we supply it and how the pig uses it. I think there'll be greater attention paid to individual ingredient effects. Right now, when we formulate diets, we bring in ingredients basically to supply energy, amino acids, perhaps minerals and vitamins and so on. But we don't often consider the functional properties of those ingredients. Now, we do to some extent in the nursery diet, right? When we are using things like whey powder and animal proteins, blood proteins, and so on, we're certainly looking at them for more than their contribution of nutrients. We are looking at them in terms of their functional effects and their impact on the gut. But that is unique. We certainly don't do that later in the nursery period, and we don't do it in the sow, and we don't do it in the grow finish pig. And I believe that's likely to change. And we'll talk about that later on. There will be more focused use of feed additives of all kinds. So in the past, we have used antibiotics as growth promotants. And of course, now we don't anymore. And one of the things about those antibiotic feed additives is that they were, especially in the nursery period, they worked 90 to 100% of the time. They were universally effective. Where when we look at alternatives to antibiotics, they would appear to be functioning only in under specific circumstances. They might only work when there's a stress on the gastrointestinal system. They may only work when the pH of the gut has risen too high due to the nature of the diet or some pathogen that's been proliferating, etc. So we're going to have to understand this new generation of additives much more so than we have antibiotics, because they're going to be much more situation specific. And finally, and this is really no surprise, I'm sure, is that there will continue to be constantly moving regulatory and marketplace targets. We are, as an industry, food safety is extremely important. That has been acknowledged by our industry for decades and decades. But more recently, consumers have expressed a preference for how animals are produced, how animals are fed, and we're going to have to pay increasing attention to that, because that is a demand of the marketplace. So in order to look into the future, I think it's worthwhile looking into the past very briefly. And if we go back into the 1960s, so a little over 50 years ago, most pig diets were formulated on the basis of TDN, total digestible nutrients, crude protein, crude fiber, calcium, phosphorus, and vitamins A, D, and E. And that was pretty much it. That obviously has changed, and one way to measure that change is to look at how least cost formulation has changed over that period of time. So least cost feed formulation in commercial practice dates back to the 1960s. And in that early time, I talked to Bob Brill, who was the founder of Brill, one of the most popular feed formulation programs out there even today, despite the fact that Bob is now retired. And he pointed out to me that in the 1960s, you could really only utilize least cost diet formulation if you had access to a mainframe computer or could access a mainframe computer through time sharing. And he explained that back then, IBM, one of their services that they sold to customers was time sharing use of their mainframe computers. Well, when we moved into the 1970s, there was the advent of the mini computers. And many people today wouldn't even know what a mini computer is, because they really don't exist to any great extent, and I don't believe exist at all in our world in swine nutrition and in the feed industry. But we still had mainframes, we still had time sharing, but mini computers, because they were less expensive, were becoming more popular, and therefore made it possible for people to adopt least cost feed formulation because they had this computing capability. Well, we moved into the 1980s, and now we have the introduction of the personal computer, which not only further extended the reach of least cost formulation from a company point of view, but also actually allowed feed salesmen, nutritionists, and so on to go out in the field and actually formulate diets in front of the customers. And when we got into the 1990s, the time sharing had pretty much disappeared. The mini computer had pretty much disappeared. And the two vehicles for the use of least cost formulation were mainframe computers and the personal computer. We could also look at how feed formulation has evolved over time by looking at the NRC documents. And in 1968, if you had access to that document, which is now 50 years old, you would see that it focused a great deal on deficiency symptoms, and specifically deficiency symptoms of vitamins. There was very limited information on amino acids at that time. In the 1979 document, there was the advent of requirements for all amino acids, and they added more weight categories. So diet formulation became more precise, both in terms of the amino acids and in terms of the weight categories. In 1988 document, they added available phosphorus, and then also, which I think was very important, added standards of expected performance. So in other words, if you fed the level of nutrients that were recommended by the NRC, here is the level of performance that you could expect. In 1998, Dr. Jim Pettigrew initiated the inclusion of a model for defining the requirements in the NRC document. Net energy was added and digestible amino acids were added. So isn't it interesting that net energy modeling more widely available and digestible amino acids is only 20 years old. And in the most recent document, 2012, there was the more sophisticated model as models had evolved. And of course, Kees Lange played a leadership role in that. And there was much greater emphasis on the factorial approach to defining amino acid requirements, energy requirements in the 2012 document than there had been previously, which had pretty much, certainly prior to 1998, had pretty much focused on the empirical approach. There's a couple of other side issues that I'd like to talk about. And first off, I'd like to talk about some of the challenges that exist in feed formulation today. And I hope that as many of you in the audience are involved in the feed industry would agree with these. And after the meeting, if I've missed any, I'd like to hear what those are. Number one is the challenge of high throughput feed manufacturing, the drive to maximize the throughput in feed manufacturing in order to keep costs down. In other words, increased volume translates into reduced cost, puts some challenges on us as nutritionists because we might want to add more diets to a feeding program because it will reduce the cost of feeding or will help us to meet the nutrient requirements more precisely. But the feed mill that we're dealing with, whether it's our own feed mill or a customer's feed mill or a customer's toll mill, may not be able to accommodate an additional diet. And I've encountered that particular situation on many occasions. Another challenge that I think nutritionists have is that there's limited on-the-fly information on genotypes and phenotypic outcomes. In other words, it would make life so much easier if, for a nutritionist, if you had information on feed intake, for example. And feed intake varies as much as 30% among farms. So trying to meet nutrient requirements when feed intake varies that much can really make it very, very difficult to be very precise. And of course, there's great differences in phenotypic outcomes that you're going to see in terms of growth rate, feed efficiency, and carcass composition. And if you had that kind of information, we could tailor diets to that and bring what the nutrients we're supplying to the pig and the nutrients that are required by the pig much closer in line, and that would reduce the cost of production or enhance productivity. But right now, we feed to a certain expected level of performance, and then we work hard to try to get the pigs to achieve that level of performance. So it would be nice if we could feed according to the performance the pigs were experiencing, maybe with a little bit higher level of nutrients in order to support improvement if improvement can be achieved. But right now, we feed to a certain level of performance and then try to achieve that performance. So it's kind of flipped. A third challenge is biological variation. We're dealing with variation in ingredients, and we're dealing with variation in pigs. Now, in the world that I now live in, which was very different than the world I used to live in when I was in Western Canada, corn and soybean meal are uniquely uniform compared to other ingredients. So as an example, we would have determined that the coefficient of variation for energy in barley, for example, is about 15%. In field peas, it's as much as 22%. In wheat, it's in that 12, perhaps 15% range. And in corn, we've determined it's down around 8%. Well, that uniformity makes it much easier to formulate diets with greater precision. But as we add more byproduct ingredients into our diets, whether it's DDGs or other corn milling byproducts or wheat milling byproducts or byproducts of the human food sector, these ingredients are all going to be much, much more variable, and we need to have very effective mechanisms in place to deal with that variability. And then, of course, there's the variability of the pig. I've already mentioned feed intake, the variability in growth. I think if we were to look in commercial practice, we would see pigs gaining anywhere from probably less than 700 grams a day to over 1,000 grams per day from 25 kilograms to market. That's huge variability. Now, within a farm or within a system, we're going to see more uniformity than that. But in some respects, not necessarily. And so that biological variation, both on the ingredient side and on the pig side, then also is a challenge when it comes to formulating diets most precisely and keeping costs as low as possible. Then there's this challenge of changing financial circumstances. The pig industry has long been noted for having a cycle of price, and price go up and prices go down, cost of feed goes up, cost of feed goes down. And we tend, for the most part, I think this is a fair statement, that we tend to feed according to the long term, and we do make adjustments according to the market, but we tend to be fairly cautious in doing so because we don't want to go so far as to impair pig performance or go so far as to increase feed costs excessively. But the challenge that we have is the pigs we're feeding today may go to market 3, 4, 5, 6 months from now. And should we be feeding according to the market conditions today? Should we be feeding according to the market conditions when those pigs go to market, etc.? We're going to see changes in that in the future, I'm sure, as we do more modeling and get a better understanding of the impact of feeding programs on performance both today and in the future. One of the challenges today, as I mentioned previously, is feeding the pig, but not the GI tract. And that is going to change because we are going to need to be addressing the issue of gastrointestinal disease or other disease challenges, and how can we feed the pig in an economical manner, but also in a manner that helps that pig to resist these diseases. And finally, there's this challenge that energy systems really are not meeting the demand or fulfilling the challenge that we have for energy systems. And I think Kees has published a number of papers that really show that the ultimate answer in energy utilization and formulating diets is really not through energy systems, but through the modeling of energy utilization of the pig. But that's a bit too far down the road for us to be talking about today. Now, there's another challenge that I think you face in the industry, and we face in science as well. We are fixated on p-value being less than 0.05. And we feel a little anxious if we start talking about what in the academic world we call trends, where the p-value is less than 0.10. But what if you are a nutritionist and you are responsible for the feeding of 500,000 pigs, 1 million pigs, in some cases 2 or 3 or 4 million pigs, and there's a p-value that's 0.2. So that means that if the p-value is 0.2, broadly speaking, we can say that there's 4 chances in 5 that the difference you see is real. And so the nutritionists then, particularly nutritionists that work for production companies, are faced with the challenge, do I consider that a real difference or not? if I considered a real difference and it's not, and I spend money to achieve that outcome, then I'm wasting money. On the other hand, if I say, well, it's a p-value of 0.2 and I really don't want to take a chance on that, I'm going to ignore it, you may be missing out on a great opportunity to make money for your company. So let's take a look at an example of this. These are data looking at superdosing of phytase. This would be in pigs from 36 to 100 and roughly 120 to 125 kilograms in body weight. And we can see that the body weight, the difference between the negative control, so I should explain that the negative control had slightly reduced energy and slightly reduced amino acids. So the performance of the negative control was lower than the performance of the pigs on the positive control, which were being fed to meet all of their requirements. So the negative control was lower than the positive control. And with a p-value of 0.22, we're getting an improvement in final body weight. And that difference in final body weight is in the range of 1 to 1.5 kilograms. That is quite substantial if you're selling that much more product at the end of the day. Now, there was no, again, average daily gain also has a p-value around 0.2. There's really no effect on feed intake. There was a, quote, trend, there we are, less than 0.1, trend for improving feed efficiency, and the same with improving energetic efficiency. So this is a dilemma that commercial nutritionists face virtually every day of the week. One of the things I'd like to point out in this same data set is if we look at the data on the basis of carcass-based information rather than live weight basis. And you'll notice that the average daily gain and the p-value in the previous slide was, what, 0.18 something? And now it's 0.07. So giving us even more confidence that feeding superdose level of phytase would improve average daily gain in growth finish. And now the gain to feed dropped from 0.08 to 0.04. So we have even more confidence that the improvement in feed efficiency is real as well. So the first point is we need to be flexible in how we interpret data and the p-values that we're looking at. And it really comes down to what is the opportunity, the value of the opportunity that I'm looking at if I make a change to my program versus what is the cost of making that change. And I'd say many of the nutritionists that work for production companies that I know, if they get a p-value of 0.2 and the value of the improved performance is substantial and the cost is modest, then probably 9 times out of 10, they're going to go with that change. Of course, the other alternative is to run a second experiment to confirm the results of the first. The second point to make here is that sometimes we should be looking at performance in terms of carcass-based rather than on live weight-based. And that makes sense because here in Canada, as in the United States, we sell pigs on a carcass basis rather than on a live weight basis. Now, I mentioned earlier, brought up, and I want to just talk a little bit further about the challenge of energy systems and some of the technical and practical limitations that they have. And first off, digestibility changes with age. So should we be using different energy values for ingredients for nursery pigs compared to growing pigs? Should we be using even a third value for sows? And that is a question that only an individual nutritionist working in a specific situation can answer. Now, energy is supplied by simple or complex carbohydrates, protein, and fat. So if I want to study lysine, I measure lysine. If I want to study phosphorus, I measure phosphorus. But if I want to study energy, I really need to be studying simple carbohydrates like starch, complex carbohydrates like fiber, protein, and fat, because they all potentially add energy or contribute energy to the diet of the pig. In the net energy system, we assume that the heat increment is waste. In other words, it is heat that's given off in the process of digestion and utilization of energy from different sources. And as we'll see a little bit later on, that's not really true. The fourth point is that measures of energy digestibility ignore endogenous secretions. So, for example, when we're measuring amino acid availability, I think almost everybody adjusts now for at least the standard ileal digestibility and accounting for at least some of the endogenous losses. And the same, we would also look at standardized digestible or certainly available phosphorus. Although there we don't consider endogenous secretions. Should we be considering that in energy? And I'll talk about that in a minute as well. Now, another challenge is that the net energy system, net energy values can be determined using more than one methodology. And that creates real problems because sometimes you have some NE values that were developed, say, by indirect calorimetry, which I think is the main standard. It's where the European values have come from, and it's where most of the values that are in the new NRC have come from. But you can also have NE values that are developed by carcass grinding, and that could give you, in fact, we know that will give you very different results. So if somebody inadvertently takes some NE values from carcass grinding and all their other net energy values have come from indirect calorimetry or based on that, then you can have a real challenge because those different values may not be, in fact, will not be compatible. And then the final point is that specific ingredients have metabolic effects, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit as well. So we're going to talk about feed formulation in the future, and as I mentioned before, we're going to be looking at enhancing how energy is quantified. We're going to have to. So, for example, when we look at energy utilization in the pig, we can go from gross energy to DE to ME to NE. You're all familiar with that. And we can see I have circled the energy lost in the feces where we do not adjust for endogenous secretions. Then we can go down to heat increment where it is removed before we get to net energy and therefore is assumed to not be contributing to the energy available for maintenance and gain. And that's not really true because that heat increment, if the animal is chilled under different circumstances, I'll give an example of that later on, then we can, that heat increment then is a value to the pig, a positive value. The heat increment, of course, can be a negative value to the pig if that pig is housed in hot conditions and is already trying to dissipate heat from the body in order to maintain a normal body temperature, and heat increment can make that even more difficult. And then there's this issue of net energy for maintenance. And we know that maintenance energy can differ, can vary in the pig. And I'm going to show the impact of immune challenge on maintenance energy requirement of the pig. But we also know that maintenance energy can be affected by the activity of the pig, by the thermal environment, and many other factors. One thing to keep in mind, 27% of the gross energy in the diet is going, on average, is going to maintenance. But so somewhere around 30 to 35% of ME is actually going to maintenance. So if we want to improve the energetic efficiency of the pig, yes, we need to look at lipid deposition and protein deposition, but we need to pay attention to maintenance energy because a big chunk, about a third of the energy that net energy that pig has is going to be used for maintenance. Let's take a look at some recent data that we have on the DE content of dietary fat sources. And this paper will be published very soon in Journal of Animal Science. And this is the energy values that were determined with 13 kilogram pigs. And so we have corn oil A and corn oil B, and look at the difference in the energy between the two, 8.5 megacals versus 6.9 megacals. Both are called corn oil, but a huge difference. This would be considered a crude fat source, and this would be considered to be somewhat more refined. This is coconut oil, flax, choice white grease A and choice white grease B. Now there's a fat source where we might think that the energy value could vary substantially, and it did vary between these two samples, but not anywhere close to how corn oil varied from 8.7 down to 8.3, so about 5%. Then there's, we only had one tallow, canola oil, poultry fat, fish oil, an AV blend, palm oil, and soybean oils A and B. And notice those two sources were identical. And I'm not surprised that they are more uniform than the corn oils, because the soy oil that we would get would tend to have gone through at least some minimal degree of refinement, as opposed to, say, a crude corn oil. So the average DE across all these fat sources is 8.4 megacals per kilogram. So the range from top to bottom was 2.1. And keep that number in mind when we're talking about the energy value of these very same fat sources in 50 kilogram pigs. But before I go to that, I just want to show you the regression equation that best explained the variation in energy. And notice for the young pig, not surprising, the free fatty acid content had the greatest impact on the variation in energy digestibility for the 13 kilogram pig. Next was the ratio of omega-3 to omega-6, or vice versa. And that really is, you might consider that to be a bit moot, because they're not present in very high quality, the same as C20 and C16. And IM, if you're not familiar, that is insoluble impurities that are measured in the fat. So there, the blue line represents the average value for the NRC, which is, if we look at our sources here, isn't too bad as an average of. They came up with about 8.4, and that's what we came up as an average. But there are some that are substantially below that, and there are a few that are considerably higher than that. Now, let's turn to the 50 kilogram pig, and notice how the shape of the curve here is quite different. It's more of a gradual decline from top to bottom, and notice that the average here for 50 kilogram pigs is 8.5 megacals rather than 8.4. So not really that much of a difference overall if you averaged across all of the fat sources. Now, corn oil A is still the bad boy with the lowest energy value even in the 50 kilogram pig, and the corn oil B is a pretty good fat source, relatively speaking, at 8.6. We get some the highly unsaturated fats like canola oil, flax oil, with the highest values. Choice white grease A and B, again, they're ranked similarly, but now there's quite a difference in the energy value for the 50 kilogram pig, where there was relatively no difference in the 13 kilogram pig. And if we look at the equation to predict or explain the differences, notice now we're getting into the ratio of unsaturated to saturated fatty acids, which would agree very much with Dr. Wiseman's publication that came out many years ago, and which really forms the basis currently for predicting fat energy concentration of fat sources, followed by free fatty acid content, and then C22 concentration, and then PUFAS. So here's the NRC again at the same value, and we can see as an average it was still pretty good, but there are now still quite a few fat sources which are well below that average, and now quite a number of fat sources that are well above that average. So it's a good average, but doesn't pick out the individual fats at all. Now, I talked about endogenous secretions, and think typically when people have done digestibility of the fat content of various ingredients, they have not adjusted for endogenous secretions. And so if we take a look at this particular experiment where we had a corn soy diet with whatever fat was present, and then we have two diets that we added wheat midds and DDGs to, but let energy float. And then we added to those same diets, we added fat so that the energy value of these two diets would be the same as this diet. It would be lower in these two diets. So these two diets had added fat. And you can see that when fat was added, that the digestibility of that fat was increased. And by the way, AEE is acidified ether extract or acid hydrolyzed ether extract. So, and all of our work that we do now, we just moved to that standard, just because you can't go back and forth between fat extracted without prior acid hydrolysis and compare it to fats that have been extracted by hydrolysis. So the conclusion, and by difference, you can say that the digestibility of the added fat was very high, around 95%, but the fat that was present in the ingredients was relatively low. That was done in early grower pigs, and we saw exactly the same effect in the late grower pigs. And so one would conclude, and many people have concluded doing this kind of work, that there is a difference in the digestibility of fat between that which is added versus that which is innate in the ingredient. However, if we account for endogenous secretions, and we do that by going in these diets and extrapolating down to zero fat intake. So we have high fat here, low fat here, and the same here, and we can extrapolate down to give us a value for endogenous secretions. We now see that the true total tract digestibility of acid hydrolyzed ether extract is pretty close to 100% in early growth and still around 92 to 94% in late growth. And it doesn't matter whether it's the fat that's present in the ingredient, which we're calling endogenous fat, or added fat, the digestibility is the same. So we need to keep that in mind when we're evaluating the digestibility of fat in individual ingredients. Now, if we take a look at these pigs here, this is not a photoshopped picture, by the way, and but what we can see in this wean to finish barn, we have pigs in this pen which seem to be relatively alert and happy and up and moving around, but pigs in an adjacent pen which are crowded. In fact, they're piling on each other. They're clearly chilled. They're trying to keep warm. They're not very happy pigs at all. Well, this is the sick pen. And so what happens when animals are sick, as you're going to see very soon, their maintenance energy requirement goes up. So the energy that they have is being diverted to, presumably, to run the immune system. And so that takes away from other functions that energy might have in the body. But more critically, probably, is the fact that sick pigs don't eat very well. And when the pigs don't eat very well, then there's less heat increment generated by the digestion and utilization of food, and therefore they need a higher environmental temperature to be comfortable. So therefore, for our sick pens, if we have pigs in there that are not eating well, we need to give them additional heat in order to help them maintain a comfortable thermal environment, which will in turn help them to overcome their illness. In this experiment by Nicole Huntley, done in partnership with Martin Iaccioti at the University of Manitoba, we'll ignore, in the interest of time, this treatment, but we'll look at the immune system stimulation treatment compared to control pigs. And the immune system was stimulated by injecting lipopolysaccharides, LPS, and you can see that total heat production went up and maintenance energy went up in the range of about 23 or 24%. Now, when maintenance energy is already running around a third of the energy consumed by the pig, then when it goes up by 23%, that's pretty darn significant. Okay, moving on then. Paying greater attention to individual ingredient effects will become a bigger part of diet formulation in the future. And here we take a look at, we add fat to the diet in order to add energy to the diet. but we also know that adding fat to the diet can affect carcass. And so, for example, if we increase the iodine value of the fat being fed, i.e. a corn oil versus a tallow or something like that, in this case, we compared corn oils versus choice white grease. And then we looked at the dietary iodine value product, and we compared that to carcass IV, or the IV of the fat in the carcass. And you'll notice that the iodine value product does a pretty good job of predicting carcass IV, except for this one value here, 6% choice white grease, because iodine value product puts, we think, a disproportionate amount of emphasis on the concentration of the fat rather than the composition. An alternative to using IVP, iodine value product, as a predictor of carcass IV. There has been suggestion that we can use the concentration of linoleic acid in the diet. And you will see that, in fact, we do get a much better curve. The 18.2 concentration does a better job of predicting the iodine value of carcass fat than was the case with iodine value product. We have an improved R-squared value using iodine value product. We had an R-squared of 0.85. Now we have an R-squared of 0.95. Using iodine value product, we had a mean square error of 2.9, and now we have of 1.7. So here's a very good example of how we're feeding an ingredient as a source of energy, but it has other impacts on the pig. And in the case of fat and the composition of fat, it is the composition of fat in the carcass. There's many, many other examples that we could use to illustrate that individual ingredients have a specific impact on the pig beyond just supplying a nutrient. Moving on to a third point on feed formulation in the future, and that is more focused use of feed additives. I mentioned earlier in my introduction that when we're feeding antibiotics, the success of antibiotics in the diet is almost universal. Probably we get a significant response to antibiotics 90% of the time, if not higher, particularly when those evaluations are done in commercial circumstances. But when we move away from antibiotics to non-antibiotic feed additives, then we're looking at situations where we're probably going to have to use these additives for specific purposes, not universally. And that's going to be difficult, because if we're a large-scale feed manufacturing facility, we don't want to start individual diets going out to individual farms, so we're going to have to overcome that. Now, one way of overcoming that would be to put multiple additives into the diet to cover an array of circumstances, but of course that will add to the cost, so you get going back again to high-volume feed manufacturing versus more precise feeding programs. Those two are going to have to be balanced out. Now, there's been a rapid increase in the number and type of feed additives that are available to the industry, and here's a list, extensive, but it's not all inclusive. But you can see it ranges everywhere from enzymes and organic acids all the way up to direct-fed microbials, lysozyme, which is gaining traction, I believe, the use of nucleotides and various plant extracts and metabolic modifiers. Wes Schweer, a graduate student with Nick Gabler, a colleague of mine at Iowa State University, did a literature review and looked at a very, very large number, well over, I think it was approaching 2,000 different manuscripts, and that were looking at feed additives. And here's just one result. This is based on average daily gain, and we can see that the green is where there was a positive response, and so direct-fed microbials worked about 40% of the time. The organic acids worked about a little over 30% of the time. Zinc and copper worked about 39% of the time. Lysozyme, but a much smaller number of experiments, worked over 40% of the time. Now, we know that these data are biased, because when you're doing research and you get a negative response, oftentimes that will not get published, or you can't publish it. Journals won't accept it. So this data set we know is somewhat biased, but we're hoping that the relative ranking, at least at this point in time, is fairly reasonable. We also know there's a lot of research that's being done in private sector, which doesn't get published in the scientific literature. Let's take a look at enzymes, for example, and here's an interesting point. We looked at the effect of xylanase on the digestibility of energy and dry matter. We looked at it in the small intestine, in the large intestine, and overall. And you can see that if we looked at those two individual segments of the GI tract, there was no difference. But when we looked overall, the magnitude of the difference was a little bit bigger, but it was clearly significant statistically. And the variation over the total tract is considerably less than the variation we saw in the outcome in the large intestine. Moving on, here's a different look at enzymes. And in this case, Chin-Young Lee, who is another PhD student of mine, was looking at pigs that were provided with either with or without xylanase enzyme, or with or without an enzyme blend, and then looked at intestinal barrier integrity, looking at the lactulose-mannitol ratio. And interesting, there was no effect of the xylanase enzyme, but the enzyme blend actually improved gut barrier function. In other words, it was less leaky, and most interestingly, this was associated with an improvement in average daily gain. So we're now wondering if, when we're looking at enzymes, we should be looking beyond just the standard digestibility, because there may be other effects on the GI tract. Now, this is a study that was reported by Jesus Acosta, also looking in the starter pig. And in this case, he was comparing a fermentation product to the control, or antibiotic versus the control, or the combination of the two. And interestingly, in terms of average daily gain and in terms of other outcomes, the combination of the fermentation product and the antibiotic was better than either of those alone. And so we start to wonder if maybe even when we are using antibiotics in starter diets for a specific disease purpose, that the addition of other additives, which have perhaps other modes of action, may actually make the antibiotics more effective. This is back to Chin-Young Lee, looking at dietary fiber. So the blue is a negative control diet, meaning a control diet, but also these pigs were not challenged. The red pigs, the red bars, represent pigs that were fed the exact same diet, but were challenged with E. coli, pathogenic E. coli. And then the green represents the control diet with soluble fiber added, which was sugar beet pulp. And the orange represents insoluble fiber supplied by DDGs. And we can see that by 7 days after the injection, that for sure we had a drop in performance due to the E. coli challenge, which was not surprising. But interestingly, those pigs that were challenged but received the soluble fiber, the sugar beet pulp, had average daily gain, or had body weight, that was the same as the pigs that were not exposed to the E. coli. And the pigs receiving insoluble fiber, the p-value was greater, but there was a trend then for an improvement relative to the to what we're calling the positive control pigs, those pigs that were challenged. Chin-Young went a little bit further. Within each of those fiber sources, she used an enzyme. And one of the other measures she looked at was the attachment of the E. coli to the villi. And you can see the attachments here within the red circles. And sugar beet pulp actually reduced the attachment of E. coli, which then could be associated with the improvement in growth rate. However, adding the enzyme removed this effect. And with using the DDG, or the insoluble fiber, there was no positive effect in terms of E. coli attachment. Another feed additive that was looked at, it was a product called Pilot. This is a number of years ago, and I think that product is sold I'm not sure it's even sold for pigs anymore. And it's not called Pilot, it's called something else. Did not have any impact on average daily gain, but it did have a substantial improvement in mortality. When we added 0.02% or 0.04%, there was a tremendous drop in mortality. Now, in order for an experiment like this to work, obviously the control pigs have to have a substantial mortality, in this case 7.5%. The study was done on a commercial farm, and this product reduced the mortality to 3 or 4%. And then finally, there's this constant moving regulatory and marketplace targets. The controversies, I think, are well known to everybody in this room. There's the use of antibiotics, possibly other feed additives. There's the use of GMOs, and then also, of course, there's restrictions on animal housing systems. Possible consequences, I think many of us are concerned that if the use of antibiotics is excessively restricted, that could have an impact on the health of our animals. I'm not talking about growth promotion, but if there's further impairment in the use of antibiotics for our animals, I would be concerned about the health of our animals, and also be concerned about our ability to meet that growing demand for animal protein that we know is going to occur over the next 20 or 30 years. So in summary then, our take-home messages, we know going forward, at least I believe, that we're going to have to enhance how energy is quantified to be able to formulate our diets more precisely and feed our pigs more economically. We're going to pay greater attention to individual ingredient effects, as well as how we use them right now, which is a source of nutrients. We're going to have more focused use of feed additives because they will tend to work in specific circumstances, not so broadly as antibiotics have in the past. And then we have to deal with the constantly changing regulatory and marketplace targets. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much. I've really appreciated the opportunity to be here with you today, and especially the honor of presenting the Kees de Lange lecture at the University of Guelph Swine Research Day. Thank you very much. The first question, now that we're getting into electronic sow feeding and producers are putting in multiple feed lines with electronic sow feeders, are we going to see a greater breakdown with phase feeding and more precise feeding of sows? And is that the next thing we're going to see in Ontario? Well, certainly electronic sow feeders do provide us with this wonderful opportunity to feed on a more specific basis. Of course, that's going to bring with it a greater demand for management, because if you are going to feed animals within a pen different diets or different proportions of different diets, then that has to be programmed into the system, and that can take some time. So if we're into a static gestation housing system where all the sows are at the same stage of gestation, that would be much easier, because we can start with a diet early in gestation that meets the needs of the sow, specifically in maintenance. And then as you move later into gestation, you can start feeding a higher amino acid diet, maybe a slightly higher energy diet, once the litter growth starts to become appreciable in the proportion of energy and amino acids required by that sow. So in a static housing system, that would be relatively easy to implement. But if you have a dynamic system and you have to be formulating the feeding program for individual sows within the pen, then that means you might supply two different diets to that electronic sow feeder and change the proportion of each diet to each sow based on her stage of gestation. But I think that would be a challenge. I think that would be really tough, and there is the risk of making errors. But it certainly will be possible. Technically, it's possible, but whether it will actually occur or not, I'm not really sure. The second question is, do you see us incorporating feed ingredient processing in how we assign nutrient values? I think, again, that's possible. We have the technology to do that. We know that the energy value of certain ingredients changes when we grind them more finely. and therefore we could assign different energy values to them. And I'm a big fan of managing all of the variability we can, because there's enough variability that we can't manage that we just have to accept. So we should manage the variability, that we can. And so, yes, I do see that with that we could be assigning different values if we're pelleting diets versus not pelleting diets, as would be one example of that. Particle size could be another one, but generally, at least in our world, small particle size is generally associated with pelleting. You can go down to maybe 450 microns, 500 microns, and get away without pelleting, but getting smaller than that, it becomes dependent on the feed handling system. Some feed systems seem to work okay with finer grinds, others become very problematic. And then the final question is with regards to energy systems and formulation, how do we balance different ingredients and amino acids and get down to a true net energy as opposed to an apparent net energy? I think that's a very, very difficult question, and I think the simple answer to that question is the only way that we're really going to be able to do that is by managing the energy supply in a diet through modeling rather than an energy system. So rather than try to get to a true net energy system, I think I'd be tempted to put my efforts into modeling energy, because that's where we ultimately want to be anyhow. So thank you very much for your questions. Really appreciate it.